resigns over a row about his controversial comments. The Guardian also leading with that story, saying experts have criticised Downing Street for condoning Andrew Sabisky's remarks. The Daily Mail reports on a blow for millions as National Savings and Investment slashes its interest rates and premium bond prices. What is the point of saving, they ask? More papers coming in, no doubt. So, the director of the Academy of Ideas, Claire Fox, just stopped being a Brexit MEP, and the current editor of the TLS, the Times of Journalistic, Abel is here. Yes, we'll see.
The clock is always ticking, alas.
Absolutely. So let's go to the kerfuffle in Downing Street, shall we? You advertise for weirdos.
You get racists.
Well, anyway, so explain the story to us for those who've missed it.
Dominic Cummings, who is a sort of Machiavellian figure that people in Westminster particularly like to write about and broadcasters like to show pictures of, because he looks a bit funny, dresses funny, and he sees himself in a sort of David Brent with a library card fashion as a kind of expert in the field. He's a slightly ridiculous figure at one level. At the other level, he is seen as the mastermind behind two great successes in convincing people to vote Leave and then convincing people to give the Tories a majority. He said in a blog that was widely circulated in Westminster, he wants to sort of shake up Whitehall, shake up the people who advise politicians and get a bunch of weirdos and misfits in. That was the sort of phrase he uses, the idea being people who think differently. And so one of them was this chap, Andrew Sabisky, who was kind of appointed with no due process. One of the big criticisms of this is whatever else we might think of what he said, there's no real sense of how he got the job, what his job was going to be, what responsibility he would have. He comes in, and then people, understandably...
He's like a future predictor, though, isn't he? He can spot trends and tell us what's going to happen
although potentially
in the future.
Not a specific future, which is not predicted. There's a famous story about, I think, Kelvin Mackenzie, when he fired the fortune teller at the Sun newspaper. He picks up the phone and says, well, you'll know what this is about, and then fired them. And so there is an irony that the future predictor didn't predict his own demise. But the point is, people have started looking at what he said, and stuff he's on the record of saying veers very close and indeed very sometimes past concepts of eugenics, scientific racism that has bedeviled people for 150 years, is kind of crass, is wrong, is dangerous, it upsets people. And they've rightly therefore said, what the hell is this chap doing so close to power with no due process? And Number 10 had an opportunity to say, well, we've wanted him for this reason, but we don't agree with these things. They didn't. They stonewalled and stonewalled and stonewalled. And then it got to a critical mass point, and then they've let him go, or he's resigned. So it's a big Westminster story. Whether it's a big story beyond that is possibly a different matter.
So I suppose that the first thing I'd say is that, look at that headline, racist weirdo in inverted commas, quits Number 10. In other words, racist isn't in inverted commas. And you do think, God, that's quite a heavy accusation. So I think that this is one of those situations where there is no subtlety whatsoever in the discussion about what this guy has said in the past. Of course, his arguments around eugenics, which he wrote on some blog or some years ago, are pretty vile, about intelligence and ethnicity and people's skin colour, and we can all condemn that. But I think you're absolutely right, that one of the problems with this is that nobody knew what the job was that he had. So it would have been straightforward, I think, or more straightforward if you'd said, we appointed this guy because he's really good at being a super broadcaster, or he's come in and done this. And so that's irrelevant, what he thought before about this, or what he wrote when he was young and a student and exploring ideas. They didn't do that, so it all kind of got very murky.
So,
That's on the one
where do
hand.
you stand on that then? Because it often seems the way that people trawl Facebook or other social media accounts and find that somebody's not suitable for a job when they may have written it many years
So it's
before.
very difficult because it was his views are objectionable and obnoxious as far as I'm concerned. But I think that there is...
For example, that black people in America generally have lower IQs than white people.
Yeah, and also that, that actually if you had forced sterilisation or abortion, that you could improve the intelligence of the nation by getting rid of a kind of underclass. These are well rehearsed, by the way. Richard Dawkins over the weekend decided to come out with some choice, the famous scientist, with some choice eugenicist thoughts. I think that, and I've actually been worried about the fact there's a lot of biological determinism around at the moment that actually is very fashionable. So this might be an unfashionable version of it. But just to go on, I think that point about, I think Toby Young's just started the Free Speech Union, and he makes the point that this is an example of offence architecture. You know, the kind of trawling... What did I say?
Architecture. Same sort of thing. The building and structure.
Starts with an A.
Yeah.
Anyway, archaeology.
Offence archaeology. Digging
Archaeology,
around.
digging around. Yes, not opposite. Offence archaeology, where you look around almost to do somebody over. And I think that there's an element of that because there's a lot of people at the moment who you feel that their jobs are being, you know, put on the line very quick because of things that they wrote in the past. So I feel anxious about that, but it's also the case that, you know, I don't think you should never be able to say what somebody's ever said. It's just that what I would like to be able to do is to have a conversation about this without people saying, because I was saying, should he be sacked or not? And immediately people say, you're a eugenicist who supports what he said. And I'm not saying that. I think we need to be open on it.
But what they've done is that this is in some ways a process discussion. If you bring in people with ill-defined rules without proper process, you don't check what they've done. You can't then say, he regrets saying that, we distance ourselves from it and we want him to do this, because you've not even got that far. You know, you've said you want these characters. And the problem he's got is that the area he's dabbling in a kind of crass and ill-thought-out fashion is an area that ultimately begins in the Victorian period with scientific racism and takes you right through to the concentration camps of Nazi Germany in a direct line. The notion that some races are superior to others has a appalling and vile, and it makes your skin crawl discussing it. And he doesn't, and maybe he knew that, maybe he didn't know that.
But
maybe he's just an
it's
idiot.
properly serious.
Yes, it's properly serious, but none of us... I mean, I haven't read his full papers. We've seen some quotes.
I've seen the quote, yeah.
Yeah, no, I've seen the quotes. But the reason I'm saying that is because there was an interesting conversation with a science journalist, Tom Chivers, that I heard on the radio, where he was saying, look, a lot of people throw around the term eugenics as a way of closing down debate on everything from, embryo research, all sorts of very positive and progressive interventions. So I simply think that the problem is, these days, if you throw the label, it sticks, quotes, then you're out. And I get nervous about that because I would at least like to be able to see
I don't. But they.
Let's see The Guardian. Hold that thought just quickly. So The Guardian also, new advisor to number 10 resigns over race and intelligence controversy. So he should never have been appointed in the first place, is what we're quoting the Labour Party chairman.
And I think the manner which is because Claire's right. You know, I think there's a desire. There should be a desire for more nuance about debates. It's very hard in the very polemicised, very polarised world that we live in. But if number 10 make this virtue of doing this thing not properly, dragging someone in, giving him a job right at the heart of government, you know, people have a right to free speech. That's a fundamental right. People don't have a fundamental right to go and work in number 10 Downing Street.
And also, apparently, he just turned up. He's been at cabinet. He just suddenly emerged.
Yeah.
So I don't in any way object to them choosing who they want to work for them. But if he suddenly emerges at high-profile meetings and everyone's like, "Who's he?" And then somebody starts finding... I mean, it's like, who is he? He's walking around with Dominic Cummings. But what I wanted to stress is his views I disagree with. There's a lot of discussion around science as the basis for policy discussion. A lot of things which I find myself verge into the eugenicist territory because there's a whole kind of discussion around neuroscience. And in fact, I think one of the stories moves on to that.
This is in the Daily Telegraph. The headline...
It's rather fashionable, in which you're not allowed to call eugenicists, but might be a bit dodgy.
OK, so this is liars may tell tall tales because they have smaller brains. So why does this fit into the categories that we've just been talking about?
Because I think it's this is presented as very important academic research from a university, from the Lancet, from researchers who basically say that people who persistently lie, steal and bully tend to have smaller brains. At least pause. And it's talk about biological determinism for certain kind of behaviours. And that kind of behavioural... the behavioural sciences, as they become very fashionable, they inform nudge policy that the government uses, the Labour Party have embraced. All of these things, these are fashionable causes. I will sometimes say, can we be a bit more cautious of biological and genetic determinism? And I'm just pointing out the hypocrisy sometimes that this is a fashionable use of it, where they start saying, if we look at studies, you can see what young people are going to do based on their brain sizes, so they haven't got agency, free will, make choices.
They also say they don't know whether the behaviour causes the change in the structure of the brain or the structure of the brain determines the behaviour. And one of the lessons in all of this just as a philosophical point, is the mind-body problem, that point at which the physicality of our brain intersects with the ephemeral thoughts, is still completely unknown. We don't understand how we think and how we believe things and how we have emotions. You know, some neuroscience will say, oh, look at the lights shining up in a brain scan, as if that proves something. And of course it doesn't. It still doesn't get to the interface. So that's a good example, I think. Claire's right that we don't know what causes things. However, you cannot argue past the point that an argument that the distinctions in race leads to one being superior to another, has one of the worst histories in the last 200 years. And the fact that this kid got into it at least suggests serious questions about his judgment. And what's he doing, as you say, popping up next to the cabinet? That to me is a kind of farcical example of process as much as anything else. If he's going to think this nonsense, fair enough, let him think this nonsense. But don't elevate him at the whim of Mr. David Brent, Dominic Cummings, into a significant position. That seems to me to be
I completely agree. And I will be accused of being an apologist now, but there was also this thing where they said, and he went to this conference at UCL, and this conference was full of alt-right, far-right, and all the rest of it. And then other people are saying, actually, it wasn't. It was a scientific conference with people that you might not agree with. And so where I get nervous is that labels are very routinely applied, and I just simply think, I completely agree with you about eugenics. I'm scared of it, I don't like it, and the scientific justification for racism is one of the most aberrant and objectionable things of the modern era. However, I also don't want to just label people, go along with what the papers say, by the way, and what people who've dug things up and said on social media as my only evidence of where somebody is apparently an evil racist.
Offence archaeology, we're trying to remember that one. We will be moving on to more familiar territory.
Boo, boo.
Can Brexit benefit all of Europe? It's going to be great, honestly, I promise you. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me this evening, Claire Fox and Stig Abel. Welcome back to both of you. So, the Brexit, she said. So this is really interesting, some might say.
Oh, good work, Annie. Let's try and sex this up a little. Yeah, why not?
Which is that the UK's negotiator is spelling out what the UK really means when it comes to Brexit later on this year.
I'm going to defer to the former MEP.
For the Brexit Party.
Because I'm completely objective.
Yeah, completely objective.
Completely objective, and I have no horse in this race. Right, so this is significant, though. So the chief negotiator, David Frost, is basically explaining to Europe and to everybody else, look, you keep telling us that we must align with you and have the same rules, but you're missing the whole point of Brexit is that we will now decide ourselves on what rules and laws we have and what regulations we follow. And if that doesn't work for you, then we won't have a deal. That's effectively what's happening. But the tone of it is very different. And I think that the positive bit from my point of view is that I think that at least the government are grasping what Brexit was, which was we will make the decisions about what we think are the most fair rules. He stresses, by the way, there's not going to lower standards. It's that you will actually just make the decisions, not based on whether we can do a deal with you. Can we shift our rules and make our decisions so that you, the EU, will be happy to trade with us? No, we will decide what are our health and safety standards, what are our whatever regulations.
State aid, he talked about as well, which is one of the great level playing field.
State aid is very important.
Yeah.
State aid, we will decide whether it's important for our steel industry to have state aid or not. We will make that decision. We will then show you, and you will say, we don't want to do a trade deal with you, but you can't force us to change the way that we make those decisions.
But we might need a trade deal. So the question, all of this seems to be a legitimate position to start a negotiation from.
Well, he says this is not a start.
He says it's not a negotiation, it's a principle. Yeah. It's the point of Brexit. We make those decisions.
Everything's a negotiation.
Not only if you think Brexit, no. But the point he's making is that Brexit is not a trade deal.
There is a trade
deal. There is a trade deal that comes out of us Brexiting, and if there's a trade deal with the EU, good. But we will be Brexiting on these rules, regardless of whether.
I think that's again a legitimate position to start from if you're negotiating. But the fact of the matter is, we need a trade deal. The EU needs a trade deal. Everything is a negotiation, therefore, that follows. The problem he's going to have to deal with, like in all of these things, is it is likely we are going to need some degree of alignment with the EU on both sides, and there'll need to be a body that judges that. Now, how you politically position that's a different matter.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not listening to the time. We've only got 1 minute left. Two massive stories. One is flooding, and one is Caroline Flack as well. So if we can just...
Well, should we do Caroline Flack in 11th? We'll do flooding quickly. I mean,
Okay.
there's an astonishing thing at the top of the... This is the damage that's been done. It's repeated all over the country. And you see the problems, even though this storm, both storms were well predicted. Telegraph has something which is very interesting, saying actually the Environment Agency recommends that flooding is inevitable, so the action should be about moving people away from flooded areas rather than stopping the flooding. And if that's taken as government policy, that's a very interesting and significant shift in...
It's called a cop-out. For once, I agree with Owen Paterson. He basically is a former environment secretary, said it was always red in the UK in winter. The trick is to get it to go down again. You have to manage the countryside and manage the rivers. It's a complete cop-out if you blame it on climate change. And I think there's a point to that, which is, on the one hand, you don't want to say that there's no relationship with climate change. You don't want to say that you're going to be able to solve all of the problems of flooding. But on the other hand, to just say we can't do anything about it, it's climate change, we'll move you out of the area you live in.
Claire, we'll do more on that at 11:30, and more on Caroline Flack. Not a lot on the front pages, but certainly will be in the insides later, so we'll do that.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll see you then. Thank you. Catch up with the weather.
This advisor who's been brought in to do a nebulous job. Dominic Cummings wrote a blog, a kind of slightly effortful, ostentatious blog in the manner that he writes, as he tries to convince the world how intelligent he is. And he said, which is not necessarily even that wrong, we need a greater variety of people advising the government. We need to think outside the box. And he said, weirdos and misfits are welcome. And one of the fruits of that eccentric recruitment process was this Andrew Sabisky, who was presented with no clear role. The government wouldn't testify to what role he was. There was no due process or clearly any checking that got him there. And so as people have investigated things this guy has said, he has said some pretty unacceptable things, specifically in the role of eugenics. The argument that there is a distinction between races. One race is genetically superior to another, which is crass and it's stupid, it's wrong-headed. Dominic Cummings made a big deal in his blog of quoting Nature magazine and Science magazines to show he wanted serious scientists, people with serious expertise. And the one fruit of that process is a bloke quoting deeply discredited, disgusting things that have gone back 150 years to people believing scientific racism, the white race is superior to the black races and science can prove it, which was a line of thinking that was ultimately accepted by the establishment to a wide extent in Victorian times and took us all the way to the death camps of the Nazis. It is a discredited and broadly stupid position to have taken, and he appears to have taken it. And because there is no due process, because we can't quite point to how he's ended up here, the government have bowed to the inevitable and got rid of him.
So, the difficulty we have with this is, first of all, this young man has appeared. There's been an investigation into the views that he expressed a few years ago that were, obnoxious and vile, as you've just pointed out, in terms of eugenics. But there's a number of things that worry me about this story. I mean, first of all, there is, at the moment, a tendency to go for offence archaeology. I've had to write it down because I said offence architecture, offence archaeology, i.e. to start digging into and looking at things that people have written when they were young or a few years ago or whatever, and say, look, their views are unacceptable.
Oh, offence.
Out.
Yes.
Offence. Yeah, offence. People having said offensive things in the past. Yeah. And there is a danger that we have a kind of slightly McCarthyite atmosphere that once you find the dread, terrible things that were said, you then call people to be sacked before they've even started. There's that side to it. The second thing I think is that there is this difficulty, which is that often young people flirt with outrageous ideas, and he obviously has done in the past. We've got no idea whether he thinks it now or not. But I'm slightly anxious as well, because one of the things that I have been going on about for some time is that there is an obsession with scientific evidence being the way that we decide moral questions, how we assess people, and so on and so forth, which I find has been a bit eugenicist myself. And that's become quite respectable and accepted in lots of policy circles. And so you can see how this kind of slippage occurs. So I would be kind of wary not just of his views, but of actually the way that's happened. One of the things about eugenics is that it doesn't distinguish between, animals and humans. Actually, it kind of treats human beings as though they're animals who can be experimented on and bred in a particular way and so on. Well, those kind of attitudes, sadly, have become rather prevalent in what? Animal rights groups who actually also make that elide that distinction. And some of the more, horrific, in my view, abuse that has been levelled at certain voters recently as knuckle draggers, Neanderthals. No, but, using a lot of that animal imagery. What I'm saying is there might be a broader problem than just this one young man.
They've allowed...
So to pick up on one of his quotes, for example, it was the fact that, in general, black people in America have lower IQs than white people.
And that's that is bad science. Well, it's been... The people who've advocated that, their methodology has been seen to be...
IQ, yeah, but also IQ tests, by the way, notorious, because one of the problems is those people who think that IQ is some kind of natural... let me assure you,
my IQ...
If you did an IQ test on me, I'd be very low. The nation as we speak will be saying no surprise there. But what I'm saying is, IQ isn't necessarily genetic, but it gets confused. There's a lot of biological determinism in today's educational debates that I worry about.
It's bad science, however you look at it.
Yeah, no, it is.
It's bad science with a horrendous history, because it goes back to these Victorians who thought if you measured the skulls of different people, you'd see that white Caucasians had a big skull and people from the tropics had a smaller skull. And that was a lie then, and it's still a lie now. And the problem is, he has a right to express these views. This is not a free speech argument to me. He's entitled to express them, but we're entitled to question whether someone who's had those views should be elevated and trampolined directly into number 10 Downing Street.
But that's why we have to untangle it. First of all, we don't know whether he has those views or had those views.
No, so he tweeted, the media hysteria about my old stuff online is mad, but I wanted to help Her Majesty's government not be a distraction. Accordingly, I've decided to resign. Went on to say, I know this will disappoint a lot of people, but I signed up to do real work, not be in the middle of a giant character assassination. So this trawling for old stuff, who in the future will be employable is almost...
I get that argument. There's also the same argument that someone quoting accurately what someone has said is characterised as a smear. And the problem is, that works both ways. He could say this is a horrible character assassination and it's my old views, but it's equally... If he hadn't had those views, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
No, I know, but are you not... But then what you're then saying... I mean, I'm trying to emphasise, because I know it'll be... This conversation will be taken out of context. I'm trying to emphasise that I do not have any sympathy whatsoever with views that are racially driven. What I'm also saying is that lots of young people have views that they change their minds about, for example, or we don't know in what context he argued this. And I'm not saying in any context it would be good, but we don't know whether it was in an essay, whether he was serious about pursuing it.
But if he'd been put into this job with due protest and checking, you'd be able to make these distinctions. Because he wasn't, he can't.
He said the media should learn to stop selective quoting, if that answers any of your questions.
Selective quoting might also be called accurate quoting.
He was also supposed to be a
super... Out of context quoting can be pretty dangerous.
Well, I can, but I mean, all I'm saying is...
Okay, well, let's move on. He was supposed to be a super forecaster, and I think the idea was to get super brainy people, obviously, in there. Anyway, so let's move to the Times. Johnson at odds with Cummings over the BBC. Mr. Johnson, the paper, suggesting wants reform rather than revolution on, presumably, how to pay for it.
I feel that there's an awful lot of kite flying going on in the leaks that are coming out about the government's position on the BBC. It's not dissimilar, actually, to a story we'll talk about after the break about Brexit. This is a negotiating position all the time. BBC, the charter starts getting renegotiated in 2023 where it's renewed in 2027. There's all sorts of manoeuvring because the government wants to pick a fight with the BBC in certain respects and probably not in others. So Boris Johnson allows there to be suggestions like the BBC will be scrapped entirely, it will become a subscription service, no more radio apart from radios 3 and 4. And then all of a sudden, another leak comes out saying, actually, maybe he doesn't quite fully agree with it. This is negotiating because the government wants to be in a strong position when it looks the BBC in the eye and says, we want these changes, it seems to me.
But one of the reasons why this story relates to the last one is because there's a sense in which you've got Dominic Cummings as the kind of big revolutionary, tearing it all up, rampaging through the establishment. Then you've got Boris Johnson saying, no, maybe I'm not going that far. But one of the things that's fascinating about what's going to happen with the BBC, if I can dare to go down that road, is I have I'm genuinely torn about this, which is why I think I sit somewhere between. I want to kind of do what Boris Johnson says, which is we should look at it, but we shouldn't. We should go for reform, not revolution. But one of the things that I, as a typical Reithian BBC type, is I defend the BBC based on Reithian values and all of these things. And guess who finds that unpalatable? People in the BBC, because they think I'm an elitist. I mean, one of the difficulties I've got is the BBC itself is not sure what its values are. And I think it'll be very interesting. It might be a negotiating position, but I think the BBC's got to get its act together to know how to defend itself. Maybe an odd thing to be talking about in this programme, but it's an interesting one as we move forward.
Let's go on to Caroline Flack, shall we? Inside the papers, on the front of the Sun, as we'll see in a moment as well. And Polly Hudson writing in the Mirror of this futile blame game over her death has been interesting to witness, hasn't it? I mean, it's such a tragedy. We've had the tributes from Love Island, the team tonight as well.
I mean, one of the first things that you learn when you look into how suicide is reported, and the Samaritans say this, and this seems to me to be no more than common sense, is that a reason for someone taking their own life is always very complicated, and it's very easy to look at external trigger factors, but ultimately we never have a window into a person's soul, not least when they're no longer around. And when someone does this tragic act, we grope for answers. It's very seldom going to be one answer. So one thing I kind of agree with Polly Hudson here is there's lots of factors in Caroline Flack's life that we are party to because of her fame and because of how the world now operates. But what's impossible to do, and it's wrong to do, I would suggest, although we will see the Sun picking a particular angle, it's never one thing that will provide a path down which someone walks to lead them taking their own life. So there may be lots of factors to it, and it could be her relationship with the media, it could be social media, it could be the cruel prosecution service, but it's unlikely to just be one thing, and people are complicated, and their lives are unknown to us, however close we feel to them, or however much they're presented closely to us.
But it doesn't mean that any of these weren't factors. It just might mean that all of them were.
Right, exactly.
But also, we don't know whether there's so many factors in what's happened to Caroline Flack over recent months that might have then contributed to the decline of her mental health, that then might have contributed to the suicide. But I think the main thing is that in the heat of the grief, and I think people do, across the board, by the way, of all ages, because she's been on X Factor, you know, Strictly, Love Island. I mean, lots of people know her for a range of reasons. And in a way, kind of much loved, and, you know, people genuine, I think, about that. There's a lashing out. And what I'm nervous about is when you start demanding changes in the law, people saying, this now means that we should have Caroline's law, that means that we should prosecute anybody who says anything horrible on social media about someone. By the way, the same people who are saying that are perfectly happy to have completely slaughtered that young, the reputation of that young guy at number 10, who we've just been talking about a minute ago. He's a racist, lunatic, eugenicist, back to the Victorian times, you know, he wants to murder everybody. You know, that kind of thing. But it's not good enough to say it's that one thing, or that we need to clamp down on tabloids, or that we've got all of... I get very nervous about an over-emotional, knee-jerk reaction to blaming everyone.
But it has gone too far, though, hasn't it? Don't you think, social media? It's
no, I don't.
The fact that people feel they can criticise absolutely anything that anyone
says. No, I know,
says,
but I mean, I just feel like, having stood for the Brexit Party, I have now been trolled to an inch of my life so regularly. But that does not mean that I want to bring in bans or censorship or stop criminalising or saying that people should be locked up. I don't like the fact that the police, the actual police, go searching around looking for...
I agree with that, Claire, but I think we have to reflect on the fact that the way we communicate, the way that people's opinions of other people's are now absolutely exacerbated and highlighted, and that connection, which can be very healthy, can also be very damaging, is going to be changing how we think about ourselves and how we think about each other. I'm not saying the solution is banning anything or blaming anything, but we have to reflect that we are effectively engaged in a social experiment involving every single member of our species, and we don't know where it's going to end up.
No, but I don't want there to be law. But one of the things which Caroline, and this is what the Sun is reflecting on, she was actually in the middle of criminal proceedings, and this is a criticism that basically says that the CPS have actually pursued this prosecution against the wishes of her partner, who she was accused of assaulting, and also the fact that the court banned her from seeing her lover, as it says here, actually exacerbated the isolation and so on. So there is an argument that's going on in legal circles, I think, about over-interference of criminal justice in people's intimate affairs, especially when actually it might not have been worth prosecuting this.
Yeah, it's an interesting extra take.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a lot to dwell over, I think, isn't there, from this certainly, but a real tragedy for
Absolutely.
everybody. Now then, coming up, it's our turn to talk tough over Brexit trade. We will talk about that story in the Mail in a minute. The Mail's take and the Daily Telegraph as well. Brexit can benefit all of Europe, talking about healthy competition between the UK and Europe.
I think that this is a significant story that actually all of the newspapers are covering, because as the negotiations start, David Frost is talking the talk, certainly.
And he's our man, isn't he?
He's our man. He's the
UK.
The talk. Yeah, I mean, this is the equivalent of Ollie Robbins. No, but you've got to think about Ollie Robbins, who was seen to have sold the past. This is the guy who's going in and saying, rather calmly,
yes,
the whole point of Brexit is not that we align or have a level playing field, or that we all get on and sit around and say how close can we be, but that we, as having left the European Union, now decide ourselves on the standards of health and safety, of state aid, all of these things. We will do that. That's why it's talking tough. And if you voted Leave, you know, this is something of a refreshing change. That it's
Nigel
not
Farage says that he's
grovelling.
delighted. I presume you feel sort of similarly.
No, but it's got nothing to do. No, it's still a negotiation, but what they're saying is the trade deal is not the end point of Brexit. The point of Brexit was that you actually make decisions yourself, accountable for them as politicians to your own electorate at home, and that you'd make those calls. Anyway, it's good news. But yes, I just want to clarify to anyone watching that I'm capable of making the decision that this is a good without having a Nigel Farage nod. And I also made the point that I actually do think that, but I genuinely mean it, that having had this faffing around with, you know, prior to this government, and I'm hardly a Tory, but prior to this, we've always had, can we keep in with the EU and can we make sure that they're happy?
We've got to do a trade deal, though.
We don't have to do one. I hope that the EU will want to do one, but I just think that the end result will not be that we just bow to what they say.
I'm going to move on, if you don't mind, because we've got probably a few months of this ahead. Sound of Fury, Imelda Staunton is not happy about chewing in the theatre. Crunchy stuff.
She's saying, why are you selling crisps? I just do not get it. None of us can be out without food for 5 minutes. She's in a long tradition of lovies complaining about the groundlings daring to do things that they don't like. Benedict Cumberbatch was aghast that someone was filming him when he's the Hamlet. If you're a good actor, you'll be able to distract people and they'll follow what you're doing. Don't moan about them. Concentrate on your own performance.
Okay, I still think chewing's a bit irritating myself. But anyway, apart from that, it's great. Claire Fox and Stig Abel.